I founded and headed the Daimler Mobility Blockchain Factory. Before I founded Power and Mobility, which is the name of the company, to continue what used to be the Daimler Mobility Blockchain Platform under the name of bloXmove. And the company and also the platform technology is originally and mainly built for decentralized urban mobility. But today I will focus on a very special aspect of urban mobility, especially urban mobility of the near future, which is very much shaped by the E in CASE. CASE being the mantra of the automotive industry in Europe in the last 5 years, that the trends of connectivity, where each car becomes a rolling computer, autonomous driving or automated driving or semi-autonomous driving with the A, servitization, meaning the car is not thought of as a product which I buy, but it's a service. I finance it, I lease it, I rent it, I ride-hail it, etc. And then last but not least, and this is the one I'll focus today, electrification. And electrification brings a completely new dimension into the area of mobility because it connects power and mobility. Because an electric car is not only a vehicle, it is also, once correctly connected to the charging station, it becomes an actual component and a part of the power grid. In German, they have a beautiful word. I like those words because they very clearly explain what they mean, even though they sound strange. They got the word Sektorenkopplung, which simply means sector coupling. And there's a coupling of sectors happening. And by some good fortunate circumstances, plus the work we've done, we find ourselves, we Power and Mobility and bloXmove, pretty much at the center of this activity, at least for the German-speaking area. And I would now like to introduce the scope and the mission by quoting the mission statement of our partner. Our partner is 50 Hertz. It is one of the 4 German transmission service operators. A transmission service operator is the backbone of the power grid. So they cover all of the former East Germany, roughly 20% of the German population receive their power over their backbone. And the mission statement is actually by their mother company, and I really like to read it out loud because it really frames very much the vision we're working to. And it also actually made me call the company we founded exactly in this way. Making the EU the world's first climate neutral economy will require more than just an energy transition. To cut CO2 emissions by 2050, many sectors will need to make far-reaching changes. 2 sectors that play a key role in society have the leverage needed to do this: power and mobility. So I put the link here at the bottom. As I said, this is not from us, but I just find this statement so clear, so to the point, so visionary, and yet so doable that we've basically adopted it as our mission statement. So I will start with some general frame towards what is the background of 2 use cases, which I will be introducing. The 2 use cases I'll be introducing are something called flexibility. It's actually a product being sold and traded in the energy spot markets worldwide, especially where you have renewable energy. And then what is called in German Lieferantenwechsel, but what is essentially charging roaming next generation, where the EMSP role gets completely eliminated. And both of these projects we're doing with 50 Hertz and the Energy Web Foundation as the blockchain and identity layer. So when you think about renewable energies, they're of course good. Everybody wants renewable energy. And because carbon emissions, etc., etc. There is, however, one major difference between power grids using renewable energy and power grids using good old-fashioned gas oil, coal, or even nuclear power. The difference being that the traditional power plants, first of all, they are essentially scalable. You don't need to spread them over the country. So you build a coal plant or a gas plant or an oil plant or a nuclear plant. And if you need more power, you build a bigger one, but the incremental space it takes is very small. So it is centralized energy producing. Obviously, if you think about solar panels or windmills, you cannot stack a solar panel, and a windmill can only be put, it needs space around it. So the power generation is now completely fragmenting and being spread out very widely over the surface of the land. So the power generation is becoming much more decentralized with renewables energies than it was with the non-renewable energies. So that is one major shift in infrastructure, which needs to be dealt with. And of course, it's good for people like us who are applying decentralized solutions to business cases. So that's number one. Renewable energy is much more decentralized than a traditional form of power generation. The other point, and this is a really big problem, is that, well, I will start with the problem. And this is very hard to imagine because it doesn't make any sense, actually. Because there has been, and there continues to be in Germany, something which comes down to negative prices for electricity. Now, there is no such thing as a negative price. It is simply a contradiction in itself. If you think about it, it's like water flowing up the hill. How can there be negative prices? But hey, we woke up sometime 5 years ago and discovered negative interest rates. So I guess all things are possible. But joke aside, what is a negative power price and why does it happen? Well, when you have a transmission service operator like 50 Hertz, who is very much committed to the transition to carbon neutral power generation, you building up your renewable power generation very fast. In Germany, we have encouraged this through regulatory and subsidies and tax, etc., where anybody who produces renewable energy is first of all paid a premium for the power that they feed into the grid. But most of all, and that is where the problem originates, is allowed unlimited feed-in. So they're giving total feed-in guarantee. Of course, why? So the investment can, you can do your return on investment calculations, and you can basically know, I can put all the power that I managed to generate from wind or from sun, I can put all of it into the grid, and I get a government-controlled and assured price, and then I do my return on investment, and in this way, there's a lot of investment out there that puts money into wind power and into renewable power. But of course, it creates the following problem. Think of a sunny, windy August day where a lot of factories are closed, half of Germany is in Mallorca or similar beaches, and there is simply no demand to match it. So a power grid is a network, it's not a storage energy. So what happens here is you have spikes where supply exceeds demand considerably. And if that happens in the power network, then it would break, things would start exploding. So what happens is Germany ends up not only giving away this very expensively generated renewable energy to neighboring countries, no, we actually pay them for the privilege of taking the power off our network, because the alternative would be that we would get a whiteout on the network. And by the way, the name of the company 50 Hertz, it's one of the best names ever chosen. The name of the company is the program of the company, because the power grid is, you keep balance in the power grid by keeping the control frequency at 50 Hertz. The moment you have undersupply, the frequency goes to 49.x. The moment you have oversupply, it goes to 50.x. So 50 Hertz is exactly the program of what this company needs to do. It needs to balance the power at 50 Hertz. And in more and more occasions, what happens is in Germany, it's on the supply side, you have these spikes that necessitate this negative pricing, which obviously costs billions of euros. Now, the reason is obvious. You need to harvest the renewable energy, because if you don't harvest it, it's lost energy. But if you're harvesting it and the people that are harvesting it are given unlimited feed-in guarantee, you need to storage. Long story short, we have a strong demand for something that in the energy market is called flexibility. It is traded on the spot markets in Leipzig and others. And flexibility is essentially the combination of a put and a call option for power. It means people that operate battery storage, bidirectional battery storage, sell the option of pulling power or putting power, and for that they get money. This is a multi-billion-dollar market. It's very little known. I didn't know about it until about a year ago, but it's a really big business, and it is very clear it will increase in scope as we are approaching a situation where the power grid is probably going to become 100% renewable. So, having said that, that is just a major problem. That is where the term flexibility comes from, and where the need for flexibility comes from. So now, with regards to what are we trying to do here? So a lot of things are being more and more decentralized. I mentioned even the generation of power is more decentralized. Another source of decentralization is charging stations, which become part of the grid, are obviously, well, not enough yet, but once you achieve critical saturation of charging stations, you will have a very highly decentralized network of charging stations worldwide, because you will have, per country, you will have hundreds of thousands, depending on how big the country is, millions of charging stations, which now can talk to tens of millions of vehicles. And as I said, each vehicle, if it is connected to a charging station over a bidirectional vehicle-to-grid technology, is at that moment potentially, and we are working on making this not potentially, but actually, is at that moment a part of the power grid. And if you then look at the battery inside of it, this battery can then now become part of an intelligent grid where it's used to offload and pull out energy. So this is the general term sector coupling, which is happening. The two sectors are being coupled. So power and mobility, and specifically power and e-mobility, are essentially going to have big overlaps. They're not going to become one sector. E-mobility is still, to the largest extent, mobility, but they are going to overlap. And already charging as a product is pretty much, from the one side, it is using completely power infrastructure. So charging infrastructure belongs to the power grid, but it is in all products, however it's being sold, it is very much already part of the value chain, of the sales channel, of the distribution channels of mobility and fleet products. So it is based on the fact that now vehicle-to-grid becomes possible. So the fact that a vehicle and a power grid can talk to each other. And another part which strengthens the direction towards decentralization is something which is emerging very, very rapidly in the energy sector. The best example is probably a farm. A farm can produce energy through methane gas, so basically through, forgive my French, their animals farting. You burn the methane gas and produce energy. Also, the animal, well, shit, basically you burn that and you produce power for that. So there's a constant power source in operating animal farms. There is also obviously a constant power need in operating animal farms. And then if you have storage facilities, so for instance, heat pumps or similar, a farm can be a storage of power, it can be a producer of power, and it's a consumer of power. And then if you look at an area where maybe you have 10 or 15 farms connected, you have all kinds of constellations where when me farm A produces excess energy, I use it for myself. Boom. Or when me farm A has need of power and my neighboring farm has excess power, we have a direct exchange and I use their power. Or all of us farms are feeding power into the grid, or we just become good old-fashioned customers of the power grid and we simply consume power from the grid. Now, if you take the last example, where obviously we are paying the power grid for the power, for the electricity, it's clear that this peer-to-peer and even the internal exchange of energy, where I use the energy that I have generated in order to basically power my own machines, that must be charged because electricity is fungible. So if there's a constant price being quoted, in fact, and that price I can always ask by simply turning on the meter, consuming electricity, then I know what is the current price of electricity. So it becomes a monetary calculation. So these producers and consumers and storage entities, they become peer-to-peer constellations of what in the energy sector is now called prosumer. So every participant can be both a producer and a consumer, and actually for good measure, a storage entity as well. So now again to the original mission statement, where the two sectors that have the ability to really achieve net zero in Europe are power and mobility. So here are two very interesting graphs for energy sources. So based on the assumption and looking at the way things are changing, and every government right now becoming basically a representative of Fridays for Future, you can imagine this curve is probably conservative. So e-mobility will account for, let's assume in 2035, you have in Germany 12.10 million electric vehicles. That would be equivalent to 41 terabytes of power, which is already, if you look at compare it to power to heat, power to gas or heat pump, it already exceeds all of the non-traditional renewable energy sources out there. And by the time continues, and I think in Germany you have roughly 30 to 40 million vehicles. I do not exactly know when all vehicles will be electric, but 2040 is probably the maximum we have to wait for that. So at that point in time, you got 40 million electric vehicles on the roads. You can do the math yourself. And by the way, to get an image on, people might say, well, a battery is so small, it's too difficult. First of all, through decentralized technologies, it becomes very easy. And you at MOBI, there is a working group that's working on the vehicle identification. There will also be a working group soon. I'm not sure within MOBI, but I know other people in China that are working on it. They are working on a battery identification because the battery and the vehicle, the life cycles are definitely diverging due to different life cycles. But if you look at the batteries, even now, 100,000 electric batteries can provide 400,000, so half of the energy that can be stored in 100,000 vehicle batteries can supply 200,000 single-family homes with electricity. So electric mobility is truly a new source of rolling decentralized power. It is net negative, of course, because net, because those vehicles are moving, they're going to be continuously consuming more power than they give. But because the biggest problem in any network, power network, is the lack of storage. And here you now have the ability to store the energy and give it back. And this giving back of the energy, which comes out of electric vehicles, will fundamentally change the way we think about power generation and power transmission. So now I come to the how do we do this and how did we actually get into this project. So we have been working, and I mentioned that earlier, we had been working within Daimler Mobility for 3 years on the mobility blockchain platform. And the mobility blockchain platform is, at the end of the day, it's a glorified transaction management and access control protocol. So it allows you on the protocol level with essentially no intermediaries. It allows you to manage the rental, sell the ticket to the rental, so sell the rental, verify that whoever now claims to have rented this car does indeed have a valid ticket, a valid credential, manage that access control, and then manage actually the billing records, and then last but not least, the settlement of it. And we do this on 2 layers. First of all, we establish legal, factual, physical truth. And in order to establish legal, factual, physical truth, and what I mean by this, Harry agreed to rent this car at those conditions. That is a physical truth, which is not digital. It's Harry and that vehicle and the renter of that vehicle that are really existing legal entities, physical entities, living entities. And we need to establish, in order, if we afterwards, if we want to invoice this automatically and put it on a blockchain, it doesn't make sense to do that unless we can always prove that whatever we are booking there is actually true. That's a point that is very often missed if people talk about blockchain being, something perfect in itself. Blockchain is a perfect record keeper, but what you put into the record falls under the beware of bullshit in, bullshit out. So in order to make a true, perfect value chain of transaction management that you can trust, not only must you have a perfect record keeper, but you must also have a way to perfectly ensure that the records you are committing to this record keeper have been validated and have been verified, the credentials have been verified, the signatures on the consent agreement and the contracts have been verified, and the identities that supplied the signatures on the digital contract have also been verified. Long story short, the whole system is based on the layer of decentralized identifiers, verified credentials, verified presentations for the establishment of actual truth, of actual credentials. Do I have a driving license? Of actual contracting, your signature, my signature. And then the blockchain is essentially attestation or notarization, where it acts as a witness with a timestamp and says, me, blockchain, I have witnessed Harry Behrens sign Car2Go's proposal. We have verified both signatures. They have been verified in turn by onboard by whitelisted trust providers. It is now UTC, whatever timestamp, and me, blockchain, with my immutable consent protocol, now bear witness that this is a fact in life. At that point in time, your contract is legally valid. That is better and deeper technology than any DocuSign, HelloSign, or whatever else you're day-to-day using in your contract agreements can ever give you. And note, that has not, the contracting and the legal verification that this is a contract has nothing to do with the very misnamed smart contracts on your blockchain, which at the end of the day are just software on ledger. So, and then on the blockchain part, you handle then the calculation, and due to the consensus that you have, you can handle all the monetary transactions, because you can also prove that whatever you are now settling is truly valid. So this is more or less the stack, and we apply it to rental of cars, and I will get to that, to rental of charging stations. And we manage that by essentially giving out the ticket in form of a verified credential, and verifying then in form of a verified presentation that a ticket has access to a given asset, be it a car or be it a charging stations. And if it does, we know all the parties of the transaction, we start the counting of the billing records, and then at the end we book it. Now, this architecture is very much the same architecture that in the power grid, the partners we are working with, 50 Hertz, and from the technical level, the Energy Web Foundation, had also identified on their side of things. So that is when we decided, all right, let's connect the two. Because their thesis was from the beginning that you need power and mobility to achieve this. They found that we are using the same paradigms, the same technical frameworks to achieve it, and that brought us all together happily. So where the energy blockchain platform is now the Energy Web Foundation, working with almost all big European, I think also a lot of American power generators, and providing the blockchain and the DID verification on the power side of things, where we provide the blockchain and the DID verification on the mobility side of things. So once devices are registered and pre-qualified, so you always need registries and ceremonies here, especially the power sector is vastly heavier regulated than the mobility sector. It resembles in regulatory complexity actually the financial sector. I would say they're roughly at the same level of complexity in terms of regulations, a highly regulated sector. So any little device that you want to connect to the power grid, it goes through whatever pre-qualification. But most of all now, if you apply the concept of hardware wallets or just simply digital identities for all your assets. So the assumption here is the solution is hardware wallet. But basically the concept is every single device gets an identity that is tied to its physical identifier. In the vehicle, the physical identifier is the vehicle identification network. I know in English it sounds strange, but we still call it, for the battery, we call it the BIN, the BIN, the battery identification number. And by using, but note please that in this picture here, these are completely different blockchains. So on the blockchain smart contract consensus level, they are completely parallel universes. Never the twain shall touch. They cannot see each other, they cannot touch each other, they cannot exchange with each other. Two different lakes. But because we are both using decentralized identifiers, which A, are on the edge, so they're completely decentralized, they're all held by the wallets, so by the user, by the company, or by the car. They are also interoperable. So we had in the past a project where a decentralized identifier issued on the ontology networks was then redeemed on our network, because decentralized identifiers are blockchain agnostic. But having said they're blockchain agnostic, the beauty is almost every major blockchain has provided blockchain standards where you can tie a decentralized identifier either to a smart contract or a wallet. So you can actually connect the two layers very nicely. And in this way, you can have your tickets, your contracts, your access rights expressed in the language of decentralized identifiers. Either side of the chains can issue them. So the Energy Web Foundation can issue DIDs and verified credentials. We can issue DIDs and verified credentials. And by putting in place the appropriate resolving architecture, resolution architecture, and the appropriate exchange mechanisms, you can then issue, for instance, a ticket giving you access to charging stations from either side, and it can be verified and from any of the players here, and then it can be brought to a blockchain for transaction processing. So this is how the two sectors are interacting. So DID being the interoperability, or actually the exchange layer. So where nowadays you use OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect to essentially transfer authorization information between two businesses that are on the same federation, this is taking that to the next level and using now between different blockchain networks, which in themselves are, for all practical purposes, absolutely secure, but isolated from each other. You use the DIDs and the verified credentials as the layer of exchange, the layer of interoperability. Those of you who are old enough to remember the term, it's essentially to the third generation of electronic documents interchange, EDI for business transactions. So what's the use case, first use case here? The first use case is, and this is billion-dollar business, $100 billion business, not sure yet how big this will be, but one thing is sure, it will be very, very big. This is the product of flexibility. So you couple electric vehicles with the power grid, and you do this, and it becomes a very clear source of revenue for the mobility sector, because the money is flowing, the money gradient is clearly from power to mobility. Why? Power network have the demand for flexibility. You talk to any spot market energy provider, they will tell you how much the daily rate is. It goes in spikes. It's a highly volatile product, actually, but there's a constant amount of money that the power generators are willing to pay in order to be given the flexibility. So, and then you got the fleets of electric vehicles that can provide it. So it's very clear the money will flow from the power sector into the mobility sector. So that's a nice thing, especially if you're coming from the mobility sector. So fleet companies now, so how do you distribute this? How do you bring this into the market? Because so far I've been talking only technical mechanisms. Technical mechanisms are good enough when engineers talk, but nobody gets rich off them. You need to now think about what are the market mechanisms behind this. And there it gets complicated. It's a completely different discussion. But the short boiling it down comes to probably one of the most promising distribution channels. It's not the only one, but one of the most promising ones is to do it through the fleets and actually the initial financing of the fleets. So you start with kilometer zero of the vehicles that are being brought into the market by fleet operators that manage the car pools for companies like IBM, like Daimler, etc. And these fleet companies, they already provide to their customers all kinds of related service, and they are best placed to aggregate, because a fleet is nothing else but an aggregation of cars. And they would then be the ones that would act as the operators, the rolling, decentralized, virtual battery providers to the power grid. And the products now, first the regulation, and then the products now need to be structured so that the fleet operators can harvest that revenue. And then you need to think how you take this to retail. So how you then distribute that to the driver, to the holder of whoever of the car. And blockchain technology and decentralized identifier is the part that makes it possible to automatically and verifiably and undisputably do this. And most of all, irreversibly do this. So, and at the end of this, by the way, and this will take me to the use case, second use case, if you are already verifying and proving at that level of detail, you can provide much more. Electric vehicles are emission-free. Good. That means the second half of the power usage is clean. They're not emitting CO2, they're not emitting NO2. Nice. But the power that they are using, is that brown electricity, is that green electricity, or the black electricity? So brown for me being oil, black being coal, and green being renewable energy. Obviously, if you really want to carbon offset 100%, you should have the ambition to, I am driving an electric vehicle and I will only put pristine green power into my electric vehicle because I like to be really clean. And that takes us straight to the next use case based on the very same decentralized tracking technologies. The second use case, in German, it's called Lieferantenwechsel, bring your own electricity provider. I would like to call it roaming, only there is already a whole business market out there that handles roaming, the so-called EMSPs, and this is actually the complete disruptor of their business model. But for the user, bring your own electricity provider is almost like roaming. It works the following way. Harry is not only the proud driver of an electric Mercedes, but Harry also wants to really make sure that he contributes to carbon net zero, loving the mission statement by 50 Hertz so much. So I get myself a contract with a green electricity provider. They are somewhere in the north of Germany, and they only produce wind energy. So I know if I have a contract with them and I consume their electricity, I've done my share. But now these guys are somewhere in the north of Germany. They operate offshore and in northern flatlands. And now I'm in the south of Germany and I'm approaching a charging station. I don't want any but that green electricity in my car. How is that possible? Well, it's possible by two things. In the power sector, they have a beautiful way of energy being fungible, very similar to water. You could do the same thing with water. They have what's called, they call it balancing. So if I am connected to, for instance, the car here in Stuttgart, and there's obviously some local cable owner that is connected here, and there is some local source of electricity which will ultimately flow into the electric vehicle, which is probably not a cable directly within the last 10 meters connected to my green electricity provider in the north. But the power grid internally, through their balance circles, Bilanzkreise, manages to count for that. So if I can approach the charging station, present the credential, I am Harry, I am a customer of the green electricity provider, Lüneburg Tech, and Lüneburg Tech answers to that. And this is all handled by OCPI at the end of the day, by the way, which is the open charging protocol, a charging point interface, which is pretty much becoming the standard worldwide. It's already mandatory in California. So, and then based on verifying that I am actually the customer of this provider, then the local, whoever feeds the power into that charging station is going to give me, for instance, 10 kilowatt hours, but it will now be balanced in the power grid. And this is what our partners from 50 Hertz will then taken care of, shifting this number up, shifting this power down, where at the end of it, they will ask the green electricity provider, all right, feed us 10 kilowatt, and we will balance it off the 10 kilowatt that the provider connected to the charging station just gave Harry, and we will give out from somewhere else, we will give him back his 10 kilowatt. And in this way, on a balancing scheme of things, and that is how it works in the power sector. Remember, electricity is electricity, it is electricity, it's fungible. By the time it's electricity, it doesn't have a taste anymore, whether it comes out of coal or nuclear or renewable. The only way you can solve it is through balancing and accounting. So, and at that point in time, however, we have balanced an account and proven, most of all, that I am using only green electricity. So this is the second use case. This use case is very much more down to earth than the first one. The first one is very big, very visionary, highly disruptive, but it'll take, I don't know, 3, 5, 7 years to materialize. This, however, is going to be rolled out, I foresee, not later than 2023. So you give customers the possibility, and companies, especially in the age of carbon offsetting, think of the combinations that you can play with this. There's actually money in this to be made purely on basically then after you have done this contract, then the fleet can turn straight around and sell the carbon offsets for that car. But that's future music. All right, and all of this is based on the Open Charge Network, OCN, which is part of the Energy Web Foundation. The protocol is OCPI, Open Charge Point Interface. And again here, the interaction is what you're essentially doing, you're using identifiers that are already being used in the OCPI, in the Open Charge Networks, using OCPI. You're translating them into DIDs or verified credentials. And in this way, you can now basically come here and use a user wallet, which is a DID wallet, present your DID, present your verified credential, and based on that, receive the electricity. And at the end of the day, the blockchain takes care of the financial settlement. Okay, so what is in it for everybody here? So fleet operators and mobility partners can connect their e-fleet, so their fleet of electric vehicles, to the grid to provide flexibility to the power grid. And that creates new revenue streams, which promise to be quite substantial for operators of electric fleets. Automated processes, decentralized, the vehicle identification, the tracking and the settlement is all done, is taken care by the tech. I believe in this round we have enough people that know how blockchain works, that know how verified credential work, to be able to roughly imagine how that works. Then the second use case I presented, bring your own power provider. It's essentially roaming to the max, but note please here, it is roaming, but whoever knows this business, the EMSAP has been cut out. The middleman has been taken out. So it's roaming without roaming charges. That's the beauty of it. And that is always what decentralized tech and blockchain does. It provides services end-to-end, peer-to-peer, without the charges that used to be connected to it, because you don't need the charges, because the protocol is so secure. The usual middlemen that do the counting for you and just sit there and say, yes, it's true, they basically become obsolete. And also recording and certification of 100% green energy is highly important, especially as we enter an era where carbon offsetting is going to very much become mainstream, and you cannot do true carbon offsetting if you cannot prove where you have offset how, which carbon, and you cannot prove any fact in life if you cannot prove the identities and the parties in a verifiable way, which brings you almost by natural logic to decentralized identifiers, and then blockchain as a consensus-driven attestation of the facts that were stated. All right, so I have, well, I think I'm pretty much in time, so I kept myself to 40 minutes, and it's a vast topic, I'm aware of that, but all I can say is, even though it's maybe it was presented more on the visionary scale, I invite all of you to contact me. This is real tech, this is real software we're talking about. So this is not proof of concept, this is not vision, this is not dream, this is actual software, code, blockchain, decentralized identifiers, resolvers, universal or not, OCPI being programmed as we speak. And the opportunity here lies, I'm not sure if any Japanese are in the call, but Japan is the obvious target market for all of this, because in Japan, all vehicles already do support bidirectional charging by law, very visionary, by the way, I have to say. So anybody with an electric fleet out there, you guys can make more money than whatever you're planning on. Your money in the future is not only going to come from the mobility services that you're applying your electric fleets to. You can make a lot of money by making sure that your fleets become coupled to the power sector, and thus becoming part of power and mobility. And there's a whole new revenue stream right there for the taking. It needs building. This is all cutting edge, bleeding edge technology. Don't expect return on investment in the next 6 months. I'll give you that just for expectations, but there is serious money to be made here. You just need to address it. And in Europe, because of how very green and how very structured the policies are there, Europe is moving quite fast on this. All right, then I'll end here and I'll end with a usual picture actually. So who are the team that are building this? And I'll open the room for questions.
Great, thank you so much. Everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Seems like we already have a few, so I can start reading those off. How do you verify that the renewable energy provider is actually producing renewable energy as opposed to using some other source?
Well, I can only answer from the German perspective, and this is a very tightly controlled country. So there are these people that are renewable energy operators. They get monitored, they get audited, because they get governance subsidies also. So they basically are direct, so they're not resellers. These people are actually the operators that operate the windmill or that operate the panels. So an Enron-like situation is not really thinkable in this environment here because it's too tightly controlled for them.
Great. Looks like people enjoyed the lecture. Thanks for your comments. Any other questions? You can submit those in the chat box here. Okay, follow-up question. So the verification is government-based?
No, it's government-backed. So the actual verification happens on the operators issue credentials to their customers, which is essentially a proof of their contract. The customer presents this proof of contract, and then the operator confirms that, yes, they have a contract with me. So the charge point operator now knows they will be getting their money or their power back from that operator. What is government-backed is the fact that they are a legally operating power generator that produces green energy within Germany. So the overall governance lies with the government. The technical details and the transaction management lie purely between the players I've described.
All right, any other questions? You can submit those in the chat box. Just will everyone receive a copy of this recording? Yes, if you're subscribed to Moby's bulletin, we'll be sending it out there. You can also email me directly if you want the recording that way. Just send my email, but we send it out via our bulletin tomorrow. We have another question. How much work would you need to adopt Moby standards for the implementation of the bloXmove solution?
I haven't studied the DID Moby has yet in full detail. I've looked at it once or twice. There would be an interoperable layer, so you would have to basically do, we call it the doorman, because right now everything we're doing is based on DID Ethereum currently and WebDID. So those are the two DID protocols that are being used here. And it would have to be adapted. If we were to do it alone, it wouldn't make sense. If there would be active participation from the Mobi working group, this can be done in a very small number of months of technical work. DID is still very young, and so achieving interoperability between two slightly divergent DID implementations, if you are pragmatic, is still quite doable. It's not rocket science. The one thing, however, I can advise, stay away from the overly complicated frameworks that achieve so-called standardization by catering to every single possible edge case of the brother of the cousin of an edge case, because they are so complicated that it'll take you months to implement it. Stay pragmatic, stay on the DID COM, on the DID resolution, on the DID method layer, and then you can proceed very fast.
Great, we have another question. Is the government participating in the chain to issue those on-chain credentials?
No, the government is not participating, but however, be aware that at least in Germany, the energy operators, they're not government owned, but they're government controlled. So, but no, this is decentralized tech. So DID is ultimately the governments will and should, I believe, be the ones that verify credentials. So in the sense, obviously, if think about it, if we have electronic voting at some point in time, electronic voting, whatever you might think of self-sovereign identity, must only be based on whichever identity the government gave you, because you can't just issue my own identity and go voting. And so you will need some kind of trusted provider of credentials that confirms that I am indeed Harry and I now go voting. And if I go to the second vote booth, then they check, no, your identity has already voted. So there is a role on the key identifiers, because if you look at the vehicle identification number, ultimately it gets guaranteed by a number of standardization committees, etc., which are governed by policymakers. The same goes for company identification, whether you use the DUNS or the LEI or whatever, or the tax identification number. Those are the few pragmatically possible unique identifiers for company. Ultimately, they function as such because the rules of accounting, the rules of year-end closing, the rules of taxation force you to use them because they are the ones that are being recognized. So there are pure crypto plays in all of this, but in the regulated markets, US, Europe, China, in the regulated markets, my personal theory still is all identities will ultimately go back to identities that have government backing, just like your tax identifier, your ID document identifier, your social security number, or whatever it may be. We just digitize it. DID becomes a digital form of exchanging them and of displaying them, but the source of your identity, I don't see that changing in the regulated market. I see very exciting social graph-generated identifiers, truly self-sovereign in unregulated market. I do not see this working in regulated markets.
Okay, we have another question. Do you see the auto OEMs being incentivized to create specific fleet vehicles for a share of the green energy rewards? Will this be sustainable for OEMs?
Well, Japan did the most direct and most brutal form of incentivization. They just said, you're not allowed to produce a car in Japan anymore if it doesn't do bidirectional charging. And boom, Japan had all Japanese newly built electric cars supported. That's also a form of incentivization. Another thing, and I can only repeat that so often, but there is a very, very widespread misconception that the OEMs are very involved in this. They are not. They are really not. Why? The OEM sells the car and they want their money after they produce it. The car service life cycle is then in the hands of financing entities, the asset financers that hold it, or hold it on the balance sheet, or the fleet operators, or whatever. If you think about the service life cycle of the car, that does not lie with the OEM. It never has. The OEM produces the car, builds the factories, and the OEM then receives the money. They need the money, actually. There are very few, there are some examples where an OEM keeps the vehicle on their balance sheet and operates the vehicle over its whole life cycle. In that case, the question would apply. But 99%, or make it 95%, and in the passenger car business, it's 100%. 100% of all vehicles that you are leasing, the OEM has no part of that service life cycle. That service life cycle lies with the financial institutions, with the asset financer and the fleet operator. They are service industry, and OEM is manufacturing industry. That's a misconception that is really, really widespread, but it's very important to bear this distinction in mind.
Great, thank you. I don't think we have any other questions coming in. Does anyone have any last minute questions? You can send those in the chat. All
right, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Harry. Just a reminder that the lecture is recorded, so it'll be available on our website and then also through our bulletin as well. And you can find upcoming lectures and subscribe to the bulletin on our website as well.
Okay, then looking forward to putting some of that. I mean, we just joined Mobi a month or 2 months ago, so I'm sure we'll work on some of this with some of the people in the call.